Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for lovers of the Bible worldwide. My name is Paul S. I'm a PhD student in Hebrew Bible at Yale University.
And I'm Rosie Candathel, assistant professor in the area of Bible and the study of religions at Wake Forest University. And hey, we are now in the second week of Lent. This is March 16th, Sunday. The lectionary takes us to Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 12, and then skips us over to verses 17 to 18. Now, this is a passage that many of you may recognize. It wrestles with familiar themes of childlessness, the promise of abundant descendants, and the gift of land as we hear the covenant to Abraham here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Paul, so lead us through this familiar narrative, some unfamiliar insights.
Certainly, I find that always working with familiar passages are like tougher than working with unfamiliar passages, especially introducing some things. But the easiest way for me to get into familiar passages is to think about the themes that come out a lot more. So I guess that's what I'm going to do. And you did a beautiful job like outlining some of the themes already, like childlessness, the promise of abundant descendants, and the gift of land. As we all know, Genesis 15 is filled with lots of tensions, I would say. Here we find Abram still very childless, no child. And that is just opposed against God's really bold, grand promise. If you read in verse 5 through 6, it says, your descendants shall be as numerous as the stars. Like it actually even dares Abraham to look up. Abram, not Abraham yet, Abram, to look up into the sky and count them. And it's like your descendants are going to be that many, you know? And to tell this to someone who doesn't even have one, that's significantly bold. And that shifts my mind to the stories that are yet to come here, you know, Hagar in the next few verses. And here in a culture where even a slave, you know, and the slave's offspring is considered inadequate to be, you know, a proper heir or an inheritor of God's promise, God makes it clear that the covenant will be established through a proper bloodline, right? Anticipating Isaac here. And according to the passage, the true heir is not the one that is born of servitude and concubinage, but the one who comes through the legitimate covenant, foreshadowing the future distinction that's going to come between, you know, like I said, Isaac and Ishmael. And it's kind of sad and depressing that the slave is basically not qualified. And that's why God would have to miraculously, you know, provide a child anticipating a covenant that is yet to come.
Yeah, I'm with you. That is a little bit of a sad note, but I'm glad you've highlighted that, right? Now, you've said that this promise of descendants, right, of abundant descendants like the stars of the sky, is supposed to counteract the pain of barrenness, of childlessness, of the inability to conceive at this point. But it is also the painful requirement for an inheritance, right? So this is one of the tensions that you sort of mentioned. How else are the people to experience blessing if there aren't any people? Right? But we also have this promise of land, this really haunting promise of land, which in the text is also filled with tensions, right? So it is a gift from God that is not earned. In fact, it's occupied by other people at this moment, the land that's being claimed here. But it's a gift that God intends to bestow on Abraham and Abraham's descendants in the text. So how do you see that tension playing out in this passage?
That's a really good question. I kept thinking about that, and I don't promise to have resolved it, but I thought about it. And here's my thought. The promise of land is central in this narrative. As we see, land is just not property, but it is sort of shrouded in like identity and destiny, like the future of the people. And I think God's assurance that Abraham's seed or Abram's seed will inherit the land, that's where we get the idea of like a divine gift from, one that's secured through a bereaved, through a covenant. And I think what's fascinating here is the way that the dialogue unfolds. For me, I think after God reaffirms his promise to Abram, God prepares a covenant sacrifice. And then we reach a really mysterious moment, a moment that I'm calling mysterious in verses 9 through 16, where Abram falls into a deep sleep. Is shrouded in darkness and uncertainty, almost as if he entered into a certain kind of a liminal space. And in that state, he is confronted with a vision where a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passes between where the animal split, or the split of the animal pieces over there. And this moment of sort of suspended animation, what I'm calling animation,
Yeah.
which is like the change of scenes, raises for me lots of questions. And one of them is, what is God doing in these verses? Why does the lectionary even pause at Abraham, who lies in darkness, i.e. in verse 12, only to resume again in verse 17 through 18, with the clear institution of the covenant? It is as if God's response is both enigmatic, it's both confusing, but also assuring, that a divine echo of what later in the different contexts we see, like with the dialogues with Moses, God's dialogue with Moses, where Moses is also seeking some kind of tangible signs that the promise of land would actually come into fruition. And so, yeah, God's action, part hidden in darkness, part blazing in light, right? It's here and there. For me, I think they speak of the complexity of what I'm thinking of here as like divine assurance in the midst of human doubt. Because the question that prompts all of this is, how am I going to know that my people are truly going to possess the land? Right? First of all, I don't have a child. Second of all, there's a promise of land. So it's like, okay, how am I going to know that my people are actually going to possess this land? And God goes through all this like sort of mysterious processes. And so I see this like, again, tension between assurance and sort of uncertainty, but also thinking of that as like a divine enigmatic moment, contrasting both ideas in a similar way. Assurance on one side and then human doubt on the other side.
What's interesting to me is, as I'm looking at the portions of the lectionary that have been removed from the reading, right? So verses 13 to 16, right? This is all about, wow, yeah, it's all about slavery, which would use it kind of talked about. Is the irony here is that the son of the slave is disqualified, and yet it is through slavery and the experience of slavery that their identity will be solidified. It is only through this experience. It is embedded within the covenant, in fact, in this kind of telling that this experience will be central to who you are and who you will be. And as you say, there's a mystery to the value of suffering. It's being revealed to Abraham, but nothing can be fully revealed as anyone who's lived life can say, right? I mean, you can know that you will suffer, but you do not know you don't know until you've gone through it what that will look like. So I find this a really interesting and deep insight that you're moving us toward. I think it has some real connection to our Lenten season too, right? This idea that we are, whether we know it or not, in these 40 days, we are embracing the kind of the uncertainty of the moment, the fact that we are human and we can only live forward. And yet there is an assurance that God is with us in the midst of it, that there is within this a promise, right? So we anticipate through Lent the experience of passion, the crucifixion, and the resurrection, right? So although we may not know the way, we are assured that there is a path to salvation, right? So I think maybe there's some nice connections for preachers as they think about how to move the Genesis 15 passage into connection with the Lenten moment for congregations that might, why do we do this? Why do we reflect this way? Why do we inflict suffering in some way on ourselves? Why do we remember this kind of experience, right? So, one thing I might ask is, how do you find these ideas maybe just influencing the preaching task as you think about Genesis 15 and even what's going on in our world, right? These debates about land, identity, belonging, who gets the promise, who doesn't, are very much a part of our world. How might you maybe help preachers who are thinking about that in connection to this covenant?
I began thinking a lot more about the discomfort I began thinking about the word discomfort as is juxtaposed here with like desire to have a child, right? So discomfort with childlessness, but also like the unfulfilled human longing and wish for a child. In giving the way that the narrative is organized, it looks like Abram's barrenness comes first and not last. That is, it is it is not the end, but it is a prelude to the promise that defies natural limitations. And so, I would sort of encourage preachers to reflect on how God's covenant sealed in this sort of mysterious interlude of darkness and sleep challenges us to trust that even in our moments of deepest uncertainty, God is still at work. And I would ask, what does it even mean to wait in darkness for a promise that seems superfluously impossible? And for me, I think this is also leaning a little bit towards what Lent in general symbolizes, right? The moment of sort of contemplative, even sober, meditative, process of faith that preserves or perseveres despite visible, evidence of the exact opposite of something not being. I was also thinking about our current climate and where like issues of land and belonging and identity are highly contested within the political context, right? And I think that this passage allows us to sort of think along a certain line, which is like, think along the lines of where land is from and God's stake in that. And especially in Genesis 15, we see that land is a promise from God. It is acquired through human conquest. Unfortunately, like as you keep reading on, it becomes about human conquest. It becomes about warfare and violence and stuff like that. But at least the way we see it in Genesis 15, I don't see it being wrapped up in our own, like innate desires of identity politics and violence. And I think that like it allows us to think about what we do when we wrap up possession of land or possession of any property at all in our sort of deep, dirty sometimes political and economic rhetoric, of who owns what and where does what come from, and rather think about like land here as a symbol of God's enduring commitment to God's people. God gives land to God's people for a reason, right? And I think that reason transcends to a good extent our own identity politics.
That is really helpful. And thank you for acknowledging the challenge of preaching into this text in this political moment, right? Where, you're doing more than just acknowledging it. You're actually giving us maybe some strategies on how to work through it. So, thank you, Paul, for this work on Genesis 15.
My pleasure. It was a very difficult text to work with. Like I said, like working on familiar passages and trying to bring out, okay, what else could be said about this passage that's like not been said or like been said over a million times, but I'm pretty sure preachers can find something good out of this.
Yes, I'm sure. So friends, we hope that you might have found something in this discussion that was both challenging and reflective, something that will feed your preaching this week. Remember that you can find several more of our back episodes and insights on our website, should you wish to find any others, on firstreadingpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your feed, and if you found this helpful, please do reach out. Leave a review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Email us. We're always happy to be in contact with our listeners. So until next time, I'm Rosie Candlethal.
My name is Paul Essa. Happy preaching.